consume the lines. Can't see your face in my mind.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Time changes things. This month we focus on what appears to be the imminent destruction of Prabhupada's branch of the Gaudiya disciplic succession, as deviants have been consuming it by so many methods for years now. In the modern and postmodern era, and even more particularly in the Western world, the negative impact of this descending octave should come as no surprise. It is my duty as a whistleblower to expose that which entered into his movement in the 70s and continues to this day. Whistleblowers are almost always unpopular, although a certain sector of intelligent people will appreciate them, especially when they are right. This becomes all the more complicated for those who blow the whistle on bogus gurus in their institution, particularly when they appear to be Vaishnav gurus. A certain anti-Vaishnava attitude or disposition entered Srila Prabhupada's movement in the 70s. This weed was watered by personally self-interested, ambitious leaders who pretended to be advanced devotees and lovers of Prabhupada when, in fact, they were anything but. It is difficult to care for any of them at this point. Most of the initiated devotees of Srila Prabhupada failed to notice this above-mentioned change back in the day, because the genuine Hare Krishna movement was still functioning side by side with what we now call, quite appropriately, a fabricated so-called ISKCON confederation. Actually, this dual track constituted the beginning of a major war, but the will to contend in this war on the part of the real devotional workers has only been present in a few so far. Most of Prabhupada's initiates got swept up into the heady zonal acharya imposition of the late 70s and the early 80s, first half of the 80s actually. However, time has made things clearer for those who truly want to see. The overall glide path for the deviation is about 40 years, and the battles are now sufficiently known. It's been dark skies and driving rain for many decades, but the fight goes on, as it must. There is no assurance of anything to the contrary, because the dispositions of the combatants has not changed at all. The misleaders responsible for this were and remain misguided men, and this theme will be expanded upon next month. That they have consumed Prabhupada's line for their own self-aggrandizement is almost a done deal. But almost is not the same thing as metaphysical certainty. There was at least one murder in the 80s, but that time of intimidation has given way now. Superficially, of course. This does not mean that anything has actually been rejuvenated for the better spiritually, because such is not the case. You need to understand the history accurately, as it was, as it is, and as you as pure spirit transcendental to all their deviation like it. At first glance, the current battle may appear to be an exact replay of the original confrontation, but it is now fundamentally different from that epoch. You need to understand these differences. The line is still being consumed, but it is being consumed in a different way. You can only understand more profoundly the actual history of the Hare Krishna movement in terms of those dual tracks, its dual tracks, as aforementioned. Unless you know both the similarities and the current differences rightly, you will become inadvertently part of a strategic failure to expose the make-show, check its momentum, and in due course, God and Providence willing, terminate the deviation. Such failure will lead to short-term personal humiliation, but in due course, worse than that. Worse as in much worse. Devotees entangled in so-called ISKCON are now in the throes of the third transformation, the Hinduization of their wayward cult. Superficially, it is not nearly as destructive as the first transformation, the exuberant and thankfully brief Zonal Acharya era. There is also not as much pressure on the ISKCON devotees as there was during the second transformation of the mid-80s, the era of collegiate ecclesiological institutionalism. The current fight is much more insidious, and it is being fought now in slow motion. It fulfills the dictum of Thomas Hobbes when he said, "It is a fight between and amongst all against the all." In the name of accommodation, reconciliation, and pseudo-inclusivity. Hobbes also rightly posited that war consists of not only fighting during a specific period or tract of time, but in the continuous inclination to fight. When the underlying factors of contention remain unchanged, such has always been the case in so-called ISKCON, and it continues to be so. The World Wide Web has changed the battlefield a bit, and so-called ISKCON eventually, if it were to triumph in this war, then if you are a dissident at that time, you will experience directly and painfully the surreptitious means the cult will use to expose you then, to persecute you. Its leaders have not triumphed as yet, so such a dire situation exists only potentially, but you still need to be aware of it. To defeat ISKCON misinformation at this time is much easier than if that institution were to gain political power, where it would certainly use cyberspace in order to remove the internet influence of its enemies that are now found there. There are some other factors now favoring our resistance, such as the fact that the ISKCON bloc is not as united as it appears to be. There are rivalries battling within it, and those rival players ultimately do not share the same ideology. Indeed, some of them have very little but the institution in common. Another way of saying the same thing is that the rival wings of the ISKCON bird of prey do not always work together, but often compete against each other. The liberals and the conservatives within that cult are both deviated, but they are not necessarily deviated in the same way. Their Maya centers upon a node of control, and that node will be discussed subsequently. The differences between the first transformation of 1978 and the current third transformation outweigh the similarities between these two deviations. The emergence of Neomut in the early 80s and Rittvik in the last months of that decade has compounded this fact. The power struggles within so-called ISKCON are both ideological and gender-based. They are not like the traditional struggles between Vaishnavism and Mayavad. We must see them as little more than in-house tempests within the ISKCON teapot. The root issues of the deviation are always ignored by both of those wings. Always ignored. To contain the influence of the cult entails first exposing its deviations, not in terms of the female Diksha Guru issue or whether so-called authority lies with the Guru or the governing body, but instead in terms of the root issues. By root issues, we mean the initial deviations from the parampara, the Guru parampara. These were inserted into the movement in the late 70s, although plenty of groundwork had been laid down previously. We have no need whatsoever to engage with so-called ISKCON. In fact, such a policy of engagement is counterproductive. So-called ISKCON is far, far beyond the level of reformation. Perhaps it was all right to care about it in the late 70s, but not any longer. Its deviations have been locked in tightly for years, for decades. You must understand its history in order to secure this perspective. So you may ask, when did the deviation start? Well, we can look at the winter of 1972 bleeding into the early spring of that year for a hint about that. 8 independently minded GBCs, all members of the power node of the cult, decided upon their own whims to convene an illegal meeting of the commission in New York City. There, big changes were made to the way Prabhupada's movement had been managed. 8 of those fellows convened that meeting, and that 8 constituted quorum technically, but the other 4 commissioners were not even informed of it, and more importantly, Prabhupada was also not informed of it. The hateful 8 voted in an assets and money centralization scheme, and even more astoundingly, transferred almost all the power to run the show to a non-GBC member, who was made secretary of the commission at that time, a new post. When Prabhupada was finally informed of this, he came down hard. That saga is a long story, but we have covered it quite extensively in previous articles and videos. As a result, on April 8th, 1972, His Divine Grace suspended the governing body commission, transferring its power back to the movement's temple presidents. All but one of the zones returned to normal, but somewhat ironically here, the one zone that suffered lasting damage from the scheme was the one in which your host speaker had joined at Madison, Wisconsin in mid-February of that year, 1972. That temple was closed. It never should have been closed. None of the real workers in the movement knew anything about all this machinations that took place in New York City, but it was a close call. Prabhupada indicated clearly, and we have documented this in previous articles, that his whole movement was almost ruined by this centralization scheme. In December of that year, his final statement about it was recorded in a letter to one of its chief organizers, when the threat to his movement appeared to have been finally uprooted. Quote, "Do not centralize anything. Each temple must remain independent and self-sufficient. That was my plan from the very beginning. Why you are thinking otherwise? Once before you wanted to do something centralizing with your GBC meeting, and if I did not interfere, the whole thing would have been killed." Do not think in this way: a big corporation, big credits, centralization. These are all nonsense proposals. So the personality of Kali was thwarted that time by the late spring of 1972, and the good momentum returned. Mostly. However, another scheme would soon emerge, and this one centered on dramatically increasing income from donations. You could say that its chief motivation was book distribution, but those who lived through it know differently. The books were a smokescreen, covering the real motivating principle: increasing the pick. Although the plainclothes collection did not really explode onto the scene until the last months of 1973, the idea of it was sprouting earlier that year. Prabhupada heard about it, and he did not like it. In February of that year, here's what he ordered. Regarding our Sankirtan party members dressing up as hippies in order to increase book distribution, this is not a very good plan. The devotees can dress up in respectable clothes like ladies and gentlemen in order to distribute my literatures under special circumstances. But even this program should not become widespread. Well, that's not even close to how things played out. There are other letters we could quote here. In them, Prabhupada insisted that even those dressing up in Western attire had to be wearing tilak with shaved head and the flag, which is known as the shika, in obvious display. The governing commissioner of Southern California bucked him at every step, protesting these restrictions. He won, Prabhupada lost, and we all lost. Was the plainclothes pick only engaged in order to engage in it under special circumstances only? Hardly. In virtually all the temples of America, the majority of devotees were sent out where the men wore wigs and the women wore short skirts, and the money, Lakshmi points, flowed like anything, especially where there was an airport. Your host speaker could go into quite a bit of detail about it all here, because I was amongst the second contingent of the collectors which opened up O'Hare Airport the day after two other devotees went out there and proved public collection viable. Oh, by the way, we distributed and collected there with shaved heads, tilak, and devotee garb. That only lasted until the Christmas pick of 1973. You didn't need a weatherman to know which way the wind was blowing. The movement's mentality changed. You were only a real devotee if you went out, distributed books, and ripped off the Vikarmis in plain clothes, because through that deception, by hook or crook, as the popular slogan was at the time, you could rake in legal tender in much greater amounts. Lie like anything, but bring in that lettuce. Oh yeah, and make sure some of the books got out too. The movement became super wealthy, but the price paid for that was steep. A mentality of compromise, a mentality of constant conflict and confrontation emerged. It was greatly exacerbated with the emergence of the deprogrammers in 1975 and 1976. Oh, the Machiavellian big shots loved this militant atmosphere because they could bum rush the devotees much more easily, pushing their buttons and manipulating whatever emotional ways and means that suited them. Also, they ought to control and use all that money as they saw fit because there was no oversight, no checks and balances on any of them. This was the beginning of the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, which run and runs parallel to Prabhupada's Hare Krishna movement during that time, his movement of Krishna consciousness. Few devotees at that time spotted this fact, but many, if not most of them, were gradually being driven crazy by these changes. Prabhupada did not really want any of this plainclothes deception, but times had become strange. Once he saw that he was unable to stop it, he decided to put the pedal to the metal and get the most he could from it. After all, if his leading secretaries were going to deviate from him in such an egregious way, he might as well get out as many of his books as possible as part of the bad bargain, especially since he could foresee the distinct possibility that his books would be radically changed after he left the scene. Tattvamasi. In late May of 1977, with Prabhupada clearly nearing the end of his manifest activities on earth, all the commissioners attended an important meeting in his quarters at the Krishna Balaram temple in Vrindavan. He was asked how his movement was to presently carry on at that time the initiations, as a long list of applicants had been piling up. No one had been recommended for initiation because he was gravely ill, and they didn't want the bad karma being put on him at that time. So answering that question, he said that he would once again reestablish the rittvik system. No surprise there. He did that in the second week of July 1977, as within a span of 2 days, 11 ritviks were authorized, most of them reauthorized, to initiate new disciples on his behalf. In other words, the ritviks performed the ceremony, but Prabhupada was the new devotee's Diksha Guru, like it had always been. During that aforementioned May meeting in the Tham, Vrindavan Tham, he was also asked how initiations were to be conducted after he departed physical manifestation, when he would, so to speak, no longer be with us. He indicated that he would appoint some gurus, and then he said, "Regular guru, that's all. He becomes disciple of my disciple." However, Srila Prabhupada never did name, authorize, recognize, or officially appoint any initiating spiritual masters at any time. Obviously, he changed his mind about doing so, and he had every right to change it. None of his disciples was recognized as an initiating spiritual master, at least not officially. Only ritviks were appointed in July of 1977. There is nowhere in either Shastra or Vaishnava tradition wherein a ritvik is automatically granted the status of an initiating spiritual master once his guru, or in this case the founder acharya, departs physical manifestation. Yet the deceptive leading secretaries merge the rittvik appointments with the so-called appointments of 11 gurus. After Prabhupada left, things started to drift, and the challenge horse of absurdity was let loose. Word circulated, and it was false, that Prabhupada had in principle appointed initiating gurus in that May meeting, and that those gurus then had been named in July of 1977. No such thing, of course. But that would not become clear until the summer of 1980, when a senior female disciple demanded to listen to the so-called appointment tape, the tape that was recorded in that room conversation in May 77. And she discovered that there were no appointments of anybody to anything on it. Yet in the spring of 1978, most of the devotees, your host speakers certainly being an exception here, trusted the GBC to do the right thing. I never trusted them. In point of fact, its leading secretaries were in the process of doing exactly the wrong thing for their own self-aggrandizement. Most ISKCON devotees did not even know that the July 1977 appointment was merely recognizing new ritviks. And the GBC exploited that ignorance, which it fostered to great advantage. Since the GBC had bamboozled almost everyone into believing that the appointment of ritviks was an appointment of future initiating gurus, the leading secretary's next step was to secure a stamp of approval from some kind of so-called higher authority. So they turned to Swami B.R. Sridhar of Gaudiya, who was the head of that deviant cult's Navadvip center in West Bengal. He asked the ISKCON representatives who approached him to reveal the basis of their new gurus. And he was informed that 11 of them were now recognized by the GBC as bona fide initiating spiritual masters. He received 2 contradictory answers on 2 different occasions to 2 different questions that he asked about it, and both the answers were deceptive. The fanatic flag waver, one of the 11 pretender Mahabhagavat Zonalacharyas, shrewdly misled Swami B.R. Sridhar in the following way, quote, "When our Srila Prabhupada left, then he has given instruction that for initiating for carry on the Sampradaya, there would be 11 in the beginning. He appointed 11 devotees, his disciples, to be initiating spiritual masters or to accept disciples. And in the future, that number would also be able to be increased," unquote. This, of course, was a blatant prevarication, as Prabhupada, merely through a letter that he did not dictate, a letter formulated and signed by TKG, with Prabhupada simply placing his signature on a line labeled approved, only appointed ritviks, not Diksha Gurus. This egregious lie that Prabhupada appointed gurus has negatively impacted the lives of every disciple and follower of Srila Prabhupada since he departed, often catastrophically. No such appointment ever went down, and a real guru would not lie like that. But then, Swami B.R. Sridhar was also told later by another leading secretary in a different meeting that the basis of the 11 quote-unquote new gurus was that they had first been appointed ritviks as a prelude to them being later recognized as bona fide initiating spiritual masters. If the Navadvip Mahant was well-intentioned, he could have spotted, and he should have spotted, and he should have spoke up about the contradictions in these 2 deceptive rationalizations that he received. But he did not speak up. Instead, he jumped on board, empowering the deviation by adding the catchy maxim, Ritvikacharya, then it becomes as good as Acharya. What that means then means after the guru leaves, then it becomes as good as Acharya. He also further encouraged their Maya by pushing them to imitate Uttamadhikari in carrying out their so-called new statuses as new gurus. He did so via a Bengali cliche, which goes as follows: Mat Guru si Jagaguru. Translation means, my guru, he's a Jagaguru. Jagaguru is a synonym for Uttamadhikari in Bengal. This illusory conception, this bad advice, was 100% against Prabhupada's stricture, viz. Regular guru, that's all. And let us always remember and never forget that His Divine Grace never at any time officially recognized any of His initiated disciples as even regular gurus. The 11 personally ambitious seeds needed some supercharged fertile soil in order to sprout, and that's just what Swami B.R. Sridhar provided for them. After understanding our movement's history clearly and accurately, it is not at all difficult to see why there is ever-increasing polarization between and amongst the various camps of devotees, mixed devotees, and so-called devotees. Those who buy into the smorgasbord idea may consider themselves to be the moderate center. But none of the leaders of the other groups both the few like us who are right with Siddhanta and right with the history and those who aren't, have any use for such a compromise mentality. As Jesus Christos so aptly put it, be ye hot, or be ye cold, but if ye be lukewarm, I shall spew thee from mine mouth. A policy of trying to find some kind of middle ground only goes so far within so-called ISKCON, although Srila Prabhupada was quite intolerant toward any kind of compromise whatsoever. A policy of compromise cannot lead anywhere, and as time passes, any so-called moderate faction will certainly shrivel. In so-called ISKCON, it produces little more than quasi-gridlock at this time. Thus, muddled thinking remains the rule there rather than the exception. Always remember that within so-called ISKCON, yesterday's "you must accept or you are a demon" hardline gets converted over time into today's rejected belief system. We see this every time there is another transformation. Not only is any given position, process, or policy in so-called ISKCON subject to reversal, it is also subject to potentially re-emerging sometime later. Do not think for a moment that the so-called ISKCON cult is incapable of turning the tables and returning to something similar to the zonal acharya worship system of the late 70s and the early to mid-80s. All of today's conditions, changes, and potential changes are due to many causes. One of those causes, not recognized by very many, is a warped version of its history. By this time, you should be coming clear about its real history, particularly if you have been regularly reading our articles and watching our video presentations. Growing conflicts concerning a vision for the future of Krishna consciousness are actually rooted in conflicts from its past. Here, of course, we are referring to Prabhupada's branch of the Chaitanya movement, both in its genuine form as well as in its now so many warped manifestations. The stakes are very high. Indeed, they could not be higher. In effect, we are dealing with the center of the esoteric plane, the innermost circle, along with what tries to pollute it on its outskirts, viz., deviations which appear to be esoteric, but are only perverted reflections of theistic esotericism. The next generation, having had no experience of what the movement was like when Prabhupada was physically manifest, while it was still bona fide, will have to make crucial choices soon. First, they must recognize that Prabhupada's branch is currently being consumed by carnival dogs disguised as gurus. It is our duty now to help that future generation make the right choices, which must certainly include complete rejection of the ISKCON alternative. If we do not now expose the evils of so-called ISKCON, and just as importantly, if we do not check the momentum of that cult, there will eventually be no individual rights in Krishna consciousness, even as soon as that next generation. They will be usurped by a tyrannical government utilizing high-tech surveillance combined with state power, and worst of all, controlled from behind the curtain by the quasi-Brahmins of the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation. That cult will misuse the concept of group rights in order to overcome individual rights, and that bias will immediately morph into the misconception that absolute truth is determined by the group. In the case of so-called ISKCON, this is where it's at now. Remember, When the 11 pretender Mahabhagavats were first exposed, the fallback position taken by the cult's leaders was that the Zonalacharya era was still bona fide anyway. This despite the fact that Prabhupada did not appoint any gurus, nor did he, nor does he, anywhere approve of imitating Uttama Adhikari by someone still on the Vidhi Bhakti platform, or lower, as in much lower. Now, what was that fallback position? Simple. The GBC approved the system's implementation because Prabhupada allegedly endowed the GBC with absolute power and authority. This mentality extends to group rights, supposedly trumping individual rights. Institutional gurus love this mentality. Even now, we can safely say that this is the essence of what we are fighting against. Perhaps it is mostly a battle of ideas at this stage, since individualism is so strongly woven into the ontological fabric of the West, especially here in America. That fact, although welcome, is in and of itself the foundation of a shaky reality. We are fundamentally opposed to the fabricated so-called ISKCON in many ways, but individual freedom for individual devotees, serious and sincere theists who chant mantras and live controlled lives, is our paramount concern. We do not consider the bugaboo of so-called, quote-unquote, social progress as anything more than a fig leaf covering the real motive, which is social control. And know it for a fact that so-called ISKCON considers social control the pivot of their movement, and especially of its power node, the Governing Body Commission. This video is not being delivered histrionically. It is instead being delivered most rationally. It is not hyperbole to warn you now that the greatest threat to genuine Krishna consciousness today is the governing body of the fabricated so-called ISKCON. You need this realization, and without this realization, there can be no resolution to the current Cold War between genuine devotees of Prabhupada and the manipulators of so-called ISKCON. Today is shaped by what went down in the past. What goes down now will shape the culture of tomorrow. Genuine Krishna consciousness is a cultural movement. It is not an organized religion. You need to understand that, and you also need to understand the accurate history of so-called ISKCON in order to grasp this essential truth. Without this realization, you will be lost. Due to so many distortions over so many decades, many, if not most, of the devotees have now gone crazy. As far as the Krishna world, so to speak, is concerned, the times have become really strange. You need to insulate yourself from all this absurdity and move outside the range of its influence. Why pour the clarified butter of your concern on the ashes of the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation? They have changed everything, although superficially it appears that they are still legitimate. So save yourself first. Sadeva Samya